This episode of Survey Program contains some adult language and spoilers, including spoilers for the 1997 game Moon. I'd recommend you listen, even if you haven't played the game and intend to, though. This is intended as an introduction, and I think the game's still super enjoyable, even with everything we say. Music for this episode contains selections from the Moon soundtrack by Thelonious Monkeys. All right, welcome to Survey Program Podcast. We're going to be talking about some of the inspirations behind Undertale and Deltarune today, but I've actually got a big, weird, broad question that I'm going to spring on you unprompted first. But before I do that, I want you to introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Elsie. I'm Photonic Dog on Blue Sky and other places. I'm a sort of amateur game developer and an insane sort of art critic about video games that doesn't publish anything anywhere.
We were already familiar with you because you were one of the people who submitted a story back to episode 1. So, if you want to go back and listen to Elsie's story from episode 1 about your, we know about your experience with Deltarune, but tell me a little bit more, since that was only about chapter 1. How have you sort of experienced the game since chapter 1 came out?
Yeah, so obviously, as I said, and then chapter 1 was kind of a surprise, but chapter 2, obviously that came during the pandemic, right at the start. And I remember at the time, I think I was also in a call with a bunch of my friends, mostly the same friends. And I just remember it being like this small little ray of light in the pandemic. Not because necessarily my life was miserable. It was actually kind of alright. I just moved out at the time, and I was doing pretty decently. But it was just everything was miserable in the world, anytime you were looking in public channels or if you were going outside, it was just very sad. And I remember thinking wow, this is a very kind thing to do, to compromise on your artistic vision of releasing this game all at once, just so that everyone can kind of enjoy it, especially given how chapter 2 was like a massive building on top of chapter 1. And I played that. Really enjoyed it.
It felt like when the game sort of stopped being a demo and started getting real,
Yeah, definitely.
Chapter 1 is great, but it definitely feels like sort of the prologue compared to chapter 2, which is like a sort of a exponential increase in the amount of polish and length in the game. But it's interesting too, because it felt like it was creating a formula that the rest of the game didn't follow.
Yeah, that was the thing, right? Because I was gonna say, I after chapter 1, I'd already felt like I enjoyed Deltarune more than Undertale, and after chapter 2, that was when at the point at which that opinion could start to be somewhat justifiable. But it really started to feel like Deltarune was setting up this sort of pattern, which is I think why in chapter 3 and 4 it feels so good that it breaks that pattern. I've seen a lot of games, a lot of Undertale and Deltarune fan games, or games sort of that try to do a similar thing even if they're not directly inspired, and they can't really help themselves but jump into that sort of sequence break, that paradigm shift head first. Yeah. But I think that establishment of chapter 1 is a very fantasy-ish adventure. You're going through a field and then into a castle and you're defeating the boss who's the big bad guy. But chapter 2 is very very loose. There's a lot less overall fantasy structure and a lot more character-driven motivation. And it turns out that character-driven motivation was the real pattern that would be getting continued on. Whereas this idea of every single game being you go into a dark world, yeah, so you conquer the dark world and save everyone, and then you leave. And the Monster of the Week style.
And then chapter 3 throws out the sort of dark world overworld paradigm, and also the whole there's a light world and dark world segment in each chapter paradigm completely. It even throws out the chapter ends with you sealing the fountain. That's not even showed. It's just elided. They just skip over that and show you the credits instead.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's it starts to become clear that we needed to get used to something in order for shifting or breaking that to actually be impactful at all. And I think it definitely works. Like I think we definitely got to that minimum point where it has that emotional impact. Because like especially now that with Tenor being fixed off screen, kind of implying that like this sort of the dark world just being gone, like nothing happening in it once the chapter ends. It's kind of we know that that's now not necessarily true because obviously Tenor must have been rebuilt between the end of chapter 3 and the start of chapter 4.
Yeah. And it reminds me a little bit of, and I think this might actually be my first Wes Anderson reference on the show, which is crazy because I talk about Wes Anderson so much. But if you're watching The Phoenician Scheme, and this isn't going to be a major spoiler if you haven't seen it yet, but it feels like it's sort of like you're like a trained Wes Anderson viewer at that point, and there's basically each segment ends when you, the audience, know what's going to happen next. It doesn't even bother showing you what happens next. It just skips straight to the next title card. It's like, you know what's going to happen. I know what's going to happen. We don't need to spend the time showing you each step of the process. Like, you know the formula of this movie at this point, and so we're just going to move on with this brutal efficiency to the next point. And it's like Deltarune respects your time so much, and I really admire that because it's so hard to cut stuff out of something that's taken a really long time to make, right? When you're
especially when you love it that much.
Exactly. Yeah. So when you're making something, you're putting so much love and time into it, the ability to ruthlessly remove the like stuff from it, when so many gamers have this like entitled mindset of like the number of hours it takes to beat a game equals the quality of the game. And of course, it helps a little bit when you're charging so little money compared to the labor that goes into a game for Deltarune. That's an avenue that's really only available for Deltarune because of A, the massive volume it's moving, and B, the fact that it also could probably sustain development on merch sales alone. Which is, that's just not true of most like indies or even AA game developers where, there's a lot of stuff that makes this game feel more independent of some of those capital G gamery pressures for content. And so it's really this like brutal efficiency. And as I was playing, we're going to talk about this game Moon from 1997, which was a critical inspiration for Undertale, and also I think has a lot to say about Deltarune, maybe even more to say about Deltarune than Undertale. That this was a game, and this was a really interesting experience for me to have over the last couple weeks because I was playing this sort of off and on, where I could, and this is a game that almost delights in frustrating you time-wise. And okay, so my previous show that I did, I had a little concept called Zeech's Corollary that sort of came up in the multiple times in the show, which is that there's this idea that in a lot of games or comics or novels or whatever, or films, there's a real value you can get out of antagonizing the reader, right? Like you can get that sort of thematic unity with something that's supposed to bother the characters, the viewpoint characters in a work, by bothering the person consuming the work, right? But the problem is, and this is the corollary, is you still have to read it. You still have to do it. And it's really tough to walk that tightrope where that inconveniencing of the viewer or reader or player is off-putting enough to make that thematic point without being so off-putting that you just put the work down and walk away.
Yeah.
And so I think I was probably playing this game under the least ideal circumstances possible, which was on a deadline. Where, the fact that sometimes you fuck up an interaction and you have to wait one whole in-game day, and early on, when you don't have a lot of energy and you can't walk back, and it's like early on it feels like you've just like wasted so much time by missing something, but if you stick through it, you're rewarded with something that I think is really unique, and it's not like modern games, which are stuffed so full of content because they don't want you to ever get bored or ever start thinking or ever start not chasing the next little shiny Springo nut on your mini map. It's like the exact opposite of that, where this game invites contemplation. And so let's talk about Moon. And tell me, Elsie, can you sum up like what is Moon for those who haven't played it? And I would say that's probably a majority of our audience.
Yeah. So I should just say right off the bat that I don't think being spoiled about Moon will sort of make the experience any worse. I do recommend going and playing Moon, but I think the game is much more about the journey than any of the destination. So I don't think you're gonna sort of lose a lot of the experience just by hearing a sort of play-by-play of the game or bits and pieces. But Moon is, so many people call it an anti-RPG, the first anti-RPG. I wouldn't call it an anti-RPG in the sense that it doesn't necessarily condemn you or condemn the RPG genre so much as it sort of earnestly asks the player to take a new view, a new light on it. Moon RPG is a game where you play as essentially a boy who at first played this game playing as the hero, and it's a very sort of standard, Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy deal. You see him at the start of the prologue playing like this little sort of pixel game where you're sort of moving around at night and you're fighting enemies in a very Dragon Questy RPG format. And then he beats it and he turns it off. And then he turns it back on again later and he gets sucked into the world and he becomes not the protagonist, but another person in the world, another sort of creature, one of the people or NPCs or enemies he was slaying. And he's put in a sort of, almost in a state of powerlessness compared to the hero persona, who now is kind of revealed that the hero in that, again, traditional RPG kind of way, was sort of seeing the world in a twisted view, where he was seeing himself as heroic and everyone was cheering him on. In reality, everyone sees him as a menace. He goes around terrorizing people and just animals around just because they look weird or threatening. And what you have as a role in the game is you're somebody who can talk and show items, and that's it. You can't hurt people, you can't move things. All you can do is sort of influence people indirectly. There's no point at which you defeat like the dragon to open the bridge forward or anything. Anytime you can move forward, it's because you've helped someone, and just a natural consequence of you helping that person has just opened the way forward.
And really critically, one of the advancement points is you are finding the corpses of the like animals, the trash mobs that this RPG hero has slain to level up in each area, and you're reuniting their souls with their bodies to revive them and sort of undo the damage, because this sort of mass wanton slaughter by the hero to level up, this grinding slaughter has actually had these like untold negative effects on the natural environment and all the people living in it. And it's got this very dim view of power and leveling up and EXP in an RPG that I think players of Undertale and Deltarune will be very familiar with, as sort of a deconstruction of this like ideology of player empowerment that is so pervasive amongst games as a medium. This is the big prickly question that I wanted to ask you about, Elsie, because I know you think about these things a lot as a game developer and as someone who, and my question is like, what are video games? Why do you care about video games? Because about 95% of video games are these sort of empty player power fantasies, right? Like, not to get all like, like first wave game journalism, fancy game journalism about it, but like what's good about video games when in most of them you are the quote unquote hero in Moon who's just mindlessly slaying?
So to me, what makes video games sort of unique as an artistic medium, and what they are in the world, is that unlike any other sort of medium, it's able to sort of put you directly in the shoes and role of a person or a force or something in the game's world, and it, by nature of that, forces you to empathize with some of it to at least some degree. You know, it might be a game where you're playing as a soldier just shooting loads of people, right? But at the very least, it's asking you to empathize with the person you're playing as. It's asking you to think about, oh, my gun's low. I need to reload because I might run out of bullets, and then I could get killed, and then I die. And obviously, you know, the actual punishment there is you just restart from nearby. And even if it is just, I guess, literally just a small time delay, the fact that we think about it almost to the same degree as literally dying, it shows that that time delay isn't the be all end all in that. It's more a trigger for that empathy towards the player character. And if a game can do what it does well, empathy towards the greater world around you. And while you can have books or films that give you a character's first person perspective or a very focused perspective, it can never fully make you understand what they're going through. It can never make you understand any sort of toil or damage they're taking. All it can do is show it to you. Whereas a game can really make you live it if it's done well.
Yeah. And thinking about that, thinking about how, like, I was thinking about the point in Deltarune where the characters felt most real, right? Quote unquote real to us. And it was during chapter 3 when you know, you, Susie, and Ralsei are all sitting down to play the video game, and their characters are moving around on the screen, and it feels so organic and real, right? In a way, because you're playing this game within a game, and like Susie's moving around and like plucking weeds and like, you know, causing mischief and throwing things around, and you like even switch roles and like switch around, and Susie's the one driving the game forward for a little bit, and then optionally you can also have Ralsei be the one driving the game. And like this is a great way for Ralsei to start to express being able to make decisions for himself instead of just blindly following you around, because he's plugged in as player one for a little bit. And it's interesting because by actually having the characters in the game express themselves in the same way that you are expressing your control in the game, it puts you briefly on that same level. And it's such a little thing. It's such a brief segment, but it's a moment where they feel more real than any sort of writing or graphics could ever make them feel, because their paradigm of interaction is the exact same as yours for a brief moment. And I think that's a really interesting fact, because you are, and this is I guess a spoiler, although I think you could derive it from first principles within about the first 10 minutes of playing this game. Like, you, the player, are both the hero, you know, the evil knight that's stomping around killing everything, and the little boy that's fixing everything by talking to people, right? Like, your initial actions as a player are this trail of destruction, and then your second chance at the game is fixing all of this destruction and trying to heal the world and empathize with these characters. And there's this dualism of the player that I think is really, really critical to understanding, like, the dualism of the player in Undertale, and I'll put a pin in Deltarune and talk about that a little bit later. But Undertale, you know, this feels very much like the sort of the No Mercy route Undertale player and the pacifist route Undertale player playing the same game simultaneously and like sharing this narrative at the same time, right? Like, there's this dual player concept that's fundamental to Moon, that's also fundamental to the different routes of Undertale, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that sort of player-character relationship, and in many ways it's at the heart of most or even all games, right? You know, in a game, you might level up, or you might unlock a spell or a new weapon or a new technique or something. But while the character is getting stronger, you, the player, are getting stronger as you learn how the game works, how best to apply this strategy, or how to best to clear or understand like this problem and solve it. So you have, in any game that's able to conjure that, which I would say most, if not all games do, that sort of dual path of mechanical progression and player progression, that's essentially your stories. That's your story, the player, and the character's stories that are entwined with one another. And bringing up Undertale on this, I was thinking while you were talking there that what is one of the moments that people love most about Undertale when they remember it? It's usually not a piece of dialogue, but it's choice. They think of like the hug him, do not choice at the end, and it's obviously, anyone who wouldn't hug Asriel there, it feels so wrong not to. But it's the fact that you have a choice not to, and that you choose to make that choice. You need that contrast in order to, for what you're doing to be meaningful. Because otherwise it's just scripted, it's just happening to you. But when you make a choice, even if it's a kind of flimsy choice, and there's an obvious answer that you would obviously pick, that the fact that you can make that choice is what makes it meaningful. And I think that's why people feel quite betrayed in other games when two options lead to the same piece of dialogue anyway, because they want their choice to feel meaningful, even if it isn't actually meaningful because it's all pre-scripted.
Yeah, and trying to push against the limits of what you can make a player feel in terms of freedom, even in this entirely scripted environment that video games represent. I mean, that's something that seems to be pervasive amongst both Toby's influences and his own career. And I hate to do this. I hate to do this. I hate to point to someone's juvenilia, because that I would hate, and I have in the past hated when people pointed to the SCPs I wrote when I was like 7, the early creepypasta ones when talking about my writing. But in the design document for the Halloween hack, the Earthbound Halloween hack that Toby made when he was 17, he's talking about how, it's really interesting how these choices that you present a player with always lead in the same direction and always lead in the same way, and shining a light on the powerlessness of a player in the end was one of the core ideas of the Halloween hack. And it feels like that original sort of nihilistic idea of player choice that's in the Halloween hack evolved and grew over the what was it, 7-ish years between that and Undertale into a much warmer idea of player empowerment, where you're actually giving the player a meaningful impact on the narrative's resolution by providing them a choice, right?
Yeah, and I think it actually, funnily enough, it mirrors kind of real life philosophical notions of nihilism and existentialism, because nihilism philosophically, without don't come after me for getting something wrong by summarizing. I know philosophy is infinitely complex, but nihilism is essentially a sort of philosophical pondering on the fact that meaning does not exist. There is no absolute meaning. But then the following school, existentialism, kind of builds on top of that and says, well, no, it's not that there is no meaning, it's that there is no external absolute meaning. Meaning is something that we decide for ourselves. And in that same way, I think that's sort of how that progressed for Toby. At least, Toby the artist, I don't know Toby the person, but the nihilism of the Earthbound Halloween hack, it falls short, because regardless of whether you say these choices aren't really meaningless and the player has no power, that doesn't change the fact that when we play games, we feel like they're meaningful in that moment, and we feel like we have the power to make some kind of effect on the game as we're playing it. So that means that even if the game, is at a objective level, makes us powerless and has our choices don't matter, the fact that we feel that meaning is there, that's what gives it that meaning. And I think that itself is a major theme in Deltarune, with its whole your choices don't matter, there is only one ending kind of deal.
Yeah. And that continued insistence that our choices don't matter in Deltarune is so fascinating, because just about everything you do is flagged in the save file, right? I mean, even the simple things of like just talking to somebody once, or every little, like, almost everything you do is flagged in the save file. And so far, we have seen our choices matter pretty significantly over the episodes of Deltarune that we've seen so far, right? I mean, there's 2 characters that can straight up die if you don't recruit all the characters in the game. And I've only seen Moon. I've only seen, so I didn't get to spend as much time with Moon. Like I haven't really sort of put it fully under the magnifying glass, right? So I've only seen the ending when you quote unquote recruit everyone, right? So as I was saying earlier, there's this, there's the system of love in the game, and I guess we should mention that in this game, your primary mechanism of leveling up is love, right? It's called love, but unlike Undertale, it's not some stupid pun. It is actual love, right? It is about befriending people, fixing their problems, or rescuing and reviving these animals that the hero has slayed, right? And at the end, you get the chance to use your accumulated love to try and put a stop to the hero, to the knight's path of destruction. And I've only seen it with and I've only seen that one ending with where you reach level 30 and you have all the love in the game. And I know that there's a scrapped ending. Is there any other ending, or is there just the one ending in the final version of Moon?
Yeah, so essentially there is only one ending.
Mm-hmm.
The only difference is that if you don't get all of the love, you miss out on a certain line a character says. But if you do get all the love, a character says, I think, one of the most important lines in the game, which is, to open the door, you'll need a love stronger and larger than what this world can provide. Something stronger than numbers and levels. And we're gonna just be clear, we're speaking about the ending. Again, I don't think that you need to keep yourself completely blind, but if you want to not get spoiled, then that's fine.
Here's what I'll say. But just as a quick, I don't think the philosophical implication. I don't think the ending is actually the most important part of this game. There's multiple laugh out loud lines and just funny characters and interesting gameplay experiences you have along the way. And so I wouldn't, if I were you, turn off this episode if I hadn't played this game before. Maybe I'm being a little selfish because I want you to listen to my podcast, but I don't think you're hurting your experience with this game by listening to us talk about it.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I would say when I was playing the game, I think there were many, many more moments that made me feel emotional, that made me smile, or even made me cry than the ending. The ending mostly made me confused and made me think about it, which I think is what a good ending does. At least in this sort of paradigm. But essentially, the ending is that basically your love is not enough. You can't open the door to light, which is the door that, when opened, will essentially stop all of this from happening. And as a result, the hero is successful. The hero defeats the dragon, quote unquote, and then defeats you right afterwards. And then you're presented with the real choice at the end, which is to continue. And if you press yes, you go back into the game, and that's the end. But if you click no, then you open the real door to light, the door out of your bedroom into the real world, because the ultimate point of Moon here is that the love that a game can give you for characters is not enough to save them. When a ending is prescriptive and it has to kill all of these characters, there's no way to save them, no matter what you do. I remember when I was a kid, I played a lot of RPGs, and all the time I would repeat parts that I wanted to change. I would repeat them and try and not kill any enemies, or I would repeat them and try and level everyone up to max and see if that would save everyone, but it doesn't, because the game can't do that. It can only have limits. So what Moon asks of you is that you bring that love for those characters into the real world, and you use and spread that love to the people and the things in it. And that's why in the credits of Moon, that you can only get if you choose not to continue, you get to see pictures in the real world with all of the characters in the game in the real world. They're fishing, or the king and his minister are outside the town hall, which is very, very similar to Undertale's ending, where you leave the underground and then you have these unplayable sequences of the characters all, jamming about and having fun in the overworld. The point there being that everyone's free, but being free here means the game has ended. If you wanted to play the game again, all you'd be doing is restarting from the start and bringing everyone back into loveless suffering.
And one of the very, very rare times where a character in Undertale directly addresses what I believe to be the player, is if you try and reload a finished pacifist save too much, Flowey tells you, let Frisk live their life, right? Like, stop trying
Hmm.
to play this like it's a game and just go into the real world, right? And let the characters live in the imagined real world of the true pacifist ending, right? And like
Yeah,
let it
exactly.
be, right? And I don't think that's it doesn't feel like a, either in this game or in Undertale, it doesn't feel like a statement where it's like, go outside, nerd. Instead it feels like integrate what you've learned from this experience, and what you've and the love and joy that you've gained from this experience, like take it with you, like instead of playing it on a screen, like take it with you in your heart and move forward with it. And
Hmm.
that feels to me like a I don't know, it's a really cool and interesting approach. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the film Goodbye Dragon Inn, um, which is
Yes, yes, definitely.
a film. It's an all time great film. It's about a theater that's closing down. It's about the very last day and the very last showing in this theater. And at this very last showing, like some of the actors from the film are milling about, and you see the various characters who are attending this sparsely attended last screening at this beaten down old theater. And you know, at the very end, there's these scenes of just like somebody sweeping the floor for minutes and minutes at a time, where it just feels like it goes on forever, and you're listening to the pattering of the rain outside, and it just fades away into life, right? Like this sort of magic of the movies that transports us just fades away into our actual life, and everyone disperses and everybody goes their separate ways, but they've all taken something from the experience that is like not just confined to the screen. It's not just something that happens on the screen, but it's something that changes us, and it's something that goes beyond our experience. And I think that there's a very sort of, I don't know, there's a sort of a last call feeling to those open-ended endings in video games, right? Where
Yeah,
you don't
yeah.
get to play the rest of the story, but it plays out in your head.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to sort of bring up an artist I like, just to speak on this matter, Twin Fantasy by Car Seat Headrest, which is a very sort of well-loved album, specifically for the fact that it depicts this sort of relationship that a lot of people can relate to. When he released his remake of that album, one of the parts of it was also a sort of meta-textual analysis and evaluation of that first album and its impact on his life and the people who listen to its life. And it ends, if you have the vinyl version, which I do because I'm a nerd, if it has a locked groove at the end. It makes use of a locked groove where it keeps playing the last little bit over and over again, and you're sort of forced to make it stop in that way because you have to make it end. And I really like art that is able to sort of both be honest about the fact that it cannot break outside of its bounds, but also encourages you to move on from it because it's just experience. It's what you take from that art and what you how you apply it in your life. Especially here with Moon, where that you should love things around you, not just people, but animals and objects and things that bring you joy and things that bring you sadness, and anything that you can love, you should love. That's that ability to say to the player, no, I'm not going to just give you a happy ending because that would defeat the point of this. I remember Tim Rogers, who, by the way, for any fans of Tim Rogers, he also translated Moon RPG for us. But I remember he said that when he first played it in 2003 and got to the ending, he felt sort of insulted. Like, oh, you're telling me, a person who likes games, who's just spent a ton of time playing your game, to just go outside and touch grass? But then he sort of realized, especially over his own review of Boku no Natsu Natsume, which I recommend, that it's because the game needs to end. But it doesn't mean that what you take from the game and the characters that you love in it needs to end. That love can still be in your heart, and you'll hold it in your heart as you leave.
And I think that's a powerful counter argument to like the Fortnite ification of games, where the idea of a lot of AAA games, it's something that you're going to play perpetually. It's going to be continually updated. There's going to be season after season of new loot boxes and endless content. And like a game is dead when it's no longer being updated, right? When you're no longer pouring new money into it, right? And this is sort of like the mainstream AAA perspective of like, if a game doesn't get updates for 2 months, it's like, if the game is dead, right? Like I saw stupid. Okay. I'm not going to say specifically, because one of my rules on this podcast is I'm not going to try to pick on any individual points. But let's say there's a beloved indie game from a couple years ago, and there's a YouTube video that's like, is this game dead? Because it hasn't had an update, because it's not a live service game, right? Like, and people point to like Steam player counts of indie games that came out years ago, and it's like, the game's dead because nobody's playing it anymore. And it's like, no, it's a story that people finished and they carry on in their hearts in perpetuity. Right? Like,
exactly. That's why I think Toby Fox doesn't want much of the likeness, because the thing is, the problem is that the moment a character starts to exist meaningfully outside of their work, they stop being a character that's a part of their work. Like, Mario is not Mario from the games. These Mario sort of the icon. Like, this is like a thing that comes up with Sonic fans a lot, is that there's classic Sonic and new Sonic and movie Sonic, because you have to reconcile the fact that the way that Sonic's treated is not as a character in these games. He's treated as a franchise. He's treated as a brand, which means he's going to be thrown into a bunch of other stuff, and you can either try and make that work in some huge timeline document and therefore make it the same character, or you just have to accept the fact that this character no longer meaningfully exists in the same way that you want it to, or at the very least, they don't only exist that way.
And it's just like we talked about last week with the way that Sans has taken on a life of his own as this sort of, totemic feature of multiple AUs, and how Deltarune itself is a parallel story to Undertale and a retelling of a new story with characters carried over into it, right? And that's only possible because Undertale's done. Undertale's finished, right? And so you can tell a new story with these characters, and it's not, competing with itself. And I think this idea of narrative finality, of a conclusion, I think sometimes it scares gamers, because gaming is a much less mature artistic medium than film or the novel or, other ways of experiencing art that we have. And so I think games are struggling with this dual identity as like a toyetic object and a narrative object. And it's, I don't know, it's a complicated thing to think about, and I'm not sure exactly where I land, because many of my favorite games of all time, and certainly the games I've spent the most time playing, are things like Super Smash Bros. Melee, which are not narrative, they're sports, basically, right? Like, they're these things that we play over and over again. But I don't think there's a better argument for something that we find a way to express ourselves with and we find a way to build narratives on than stuff that's played at esport level or like fighting games, where people, rather than playing through a linear narrative in a video game, they find a way to express their personality through the game. And in fact, they're touching more grass than anybody else because they're traveling around the world and playing against other people and sharing what the game means to them with other people, right? And so people treat these games that are more, maybe even more purely toyetic, the narrative games as like trifles, but I actually would argue that maybe they're more in line with with the true pacifist ending of Undertale and this ending of Moon, about going outside and letting this game mean something to you in the future, because people are meeting each other and building these stories and building these legends using the game and what it gives you as a tool, as a building block to express themselves and build something bigger. And I don't think this is a totally bullshit argument to make. I don't think this is coming out of left field, even from like a biographical perspective, because like Toby Fox is a fighting game player. Like, he's somebody who used to go and travel around and play Super Smash Bros. Melee tournaments, right? And like, that's...
Yeah, so it's funny actually you bring up Super Smash Bros. Because that is actually, in my opinion, one of the sleeper inspirations for Undertale and Deltarune. Because if you're aware of the narrative, which not many people know, but there is actually a sort of story or narrative going on in the Smash Bros. Games from the first game to Melee to Brawl, through 4/Ultimate. I'm not really sure if I'm not sure if it's super maps through into Ultimate, but it's very coherent from 1 to 4, essentially. That these fighters, they're toys. You know, they're actually toys in someone's bedroom, and they're just making them fight with their hand. That's what Master Hand and later Crazy Hand sort of being kind of a metaphor for another person you're now playing this game with, who kind of has a very different idea of how they want to play the game. Like, that you're sort of making these toys fight, and that's sort of what games are. They're you playing around with toys, but playing around with toys in a very sort of a sandbox that's built in a special way, that you can have these, what we call like, we sort of, I say we, but we call it like emergent storytelling. Storytelling that isn't prescripted, or it's not rewritten or pre-written before the game starts. It's something that happens from a result of playing the game that isn't in the game itself. And in Brawl, the story in Brawl, which I do think that the Subspace Emissary mode in Brawl is an inspiration for Undertale and Deltarune in this way. That is about, I mean, the main boss of it is literally called Taboo, and his entire thing is freezing all of these toys into little statues and putting them into a collection and never touching them again, and just having them, you know, exist as something that you can just ogle at, and you can do whatever you know, you can, like, not basically draining the idea of being able to have fun with them. And the sort of main point of that, at least to me, is no, what you should do with toys is you should play with them. You shouldn't collect them and put them away. You should use them and let yourself wear and tear them down. And even if it looks childish, or there's a quote-unquote taboo against it, you know, what those characters mean to you, even if they are just toys, they still have meaning beyond that. They're still characters. These are personalities and wants and goals and dreams, and they don't disappear just because you stop playing with them.
Absolutely. I think what you've just said there actually gets me to a resolution of what I was saying about the narrative versus the toyetic, right? Because I think, you know, when this sort of new wave of modern game criticism started to come about in the 2010s, there was this sort of pervasive idea then that I would say maybe emerged around the same time as like the Twine-ish sort of movement in games, is like that the serious game is one with no gameplay at all, that's just a novel, right? Like that the more a game resembles a novel, the more that it is, you know, the more serious that it is, and the more that the game resembles a toy, the less serious it is. But it seems to me that there's a new thrust in game development, and one that has a long, you know, period of history going back to the original development of the RPG, that really the maturation of games as a medium is going to take a synthesis of both of those elements, right? Where you need a narrative that complements the play, right? That complements the ludic or toyetic elements of a game. And only by combining those two things can you create something that is uniquely a game. Can you create an artistic expression that is uniquely a game? That's not a sport, and it's not a novel, it's not a film, it's a game, right? And Deltarune feels like a really, and that's part of why I'm so fascinated by Deltarune, because it feels like a really mature blend of ludic elements and narrative, and it's presaged by a lot of these small strange games that preceded it in the 90s. And it's not just Moon, we're using Moon as a framing device here, but like, these games that were trying to expand the boundaries of what your typical hack and slash or like JRPG meant, that really feel like they were presaging this sort of postmodern development in games of synthesizing these two perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, because it's honestly it's the sort of natural conclusion that you come to when you really think about it at its core, and obviously it's not necessarily easy to make a game like that when you're doing it from an industry standpoint, because if you're doing it as a game studio and you have a big publisher over your head and whatnot, and you have employees to feed, you have to make a game that makes money because that you need to make money for your employees and you have to make money for your publisher and etc. And that means that you have to sort of give in to a lot of audience interests, which means that prior to sort of the tools to make indie games becoming a lot more public and usable, it was a lot harder to make a game like this. And that's why, games that are able to achieve this have to be made by they're always made by particular studios. You have Onion Games, who made Moon RPG. You've got Suda51, who made Killer 7 and No More Heroes, which are also games that take on a lot of this stuff, especially Killer 7 and Killer is Dead. And even like HAL Laboratories, which is one of the companies that works under Nintendo, made Kirby and Smash Bros. The only reason that they were even able to have this sort of feeling behind them is because of Masahiro Sakurai, who had these thoughts and feelings about this game and has sort of influenced the rest of the company. I don't want to pretend that HAL Laboratory is just Sakurai. It's a lot of people. There's a lot of other directors, but it's the fact that you can show that a game can fuse these things and still be profitable that allows it to exist. But even then, you can notice that those kinds of games that HAL Laboratories makes, even games that I love that we'll talk about later, like Mother 3, they're still a bit more compromised towards profitability than something like Moon RPG or Killer 7 or Deltarune.
Yeah. And it's interesting too. I mean, I can't help but think, I mean, when you're talking about these sort of more artistic or more uniquely game ways to express an artistic feeling, I mean, you do have to talk a little bit about you have to talk about Metal Gear Solid, but I especially want to talk about Death Stranding, right? Because like Death Stranding, people always, I think there's a little bit of a lazy line of criticism about Kojima that's like he just wants to make films. But when you're playing Death Stranding, right, there are these extended periods of pure gameplay where the only narrative expression you're experiencing is this feeling of using your game controller to keep someone physically balanced, right? And like move and traversing through the game world in this immensely like complicated way. And it's all about the feel and like the journey that Sam is on in that game would not feel impactful if you were just watching a video of it or even if you were reading prose about it. It's the fact that you're like physically feeling all the burdens you're putting on this character that makes it effective narratively. And that's another great example of someone who was only able to make these expressive artistic games within a major studio context because of prior success in the space, right? Like that, that yeah. And this is true of all art, right?
Yeah.
That it's really, really hard to make true art these days without having experienced some sort of commercial success beforehand. And that's true in just about every medium, and that's why our art galleries are full of terrible art by Nepo babies.
No, exactly. I mean, it's, like we were talking about Wes Anderson earlier, you couldn't have these newer Wes Anderson films that can sort of take a introspective and evaluative look of his own work without having that prior work. And I think the difference is ultimately, commercial funding, it just enables you to make a game faster or a film or whatever you have you. But, like Toby Fox, for example, all he had before Undertale, other than Kickstarter, which definitely helped in the situation, no doubt about it, but was the Earthbound Halloween hack, and I think some of the sort of small games that he made with his brother per one of his interviews. And that's the thing, right? Is that unfortunately, as much as we would love to believe that the art creation process is sort of democratized and anyone can make art, you really need to have a sort of, I don't want to say wealth, but you need to have a sort of at least level of privilege in your life that you can comfortably sit there and make art, that it isn't profitable, and someone can pay the rent for you while you do that. I think that's something that is really sort of underspoken, because it's either you do that or you start a studio and you make profitable games before you make artistic games. I think it's not just a problem in games, really. It's a problem across all artistic mediums.
I mean, Disco Elysium was developed in a squat.
Yeah.
and
like they had to take money from a fraudster, so alleged fraudster.
Please don't sue me. And even then, commercial success is no guarantee that you're going to get to keep doing it, right? I mean, as you saw with Disco Elysium, right? Like the acrimony and the fight over the money that resulted from that game led to almost all of the artists responsible for the brilliance of Disco Elysium being scattered to the winds. And there's so many stories like that in independent art of all kinds, where even if you've put a funding stack together, there's no guarantee you're going to be able to hold on to it.
Even if you're a studio that's made a game of the year, like I remember Hi-Fi Rush, the studio got closed, even though Hi-Fi Rush won I think multiple Game of the Year awards and was very, very popular. Unfortunately, we're still always beholden to the people who fund us, and when the people who fund us have absolute power and a different idea of where they want that art to go, they get to control that. And it's why I'm quite happy that Toby Fox has his own team that seem to be under his sort of control to some degree, because that's a really rare situation to be in. Like, that's a really, like, I hope that people who are inspired by Toby Fox don't try and think like, well, I can't do that, so what value do I have? Like, I think he would be the first to say that he's very lucky to be able to have a whole team working under him at his direction that doesn't have to answer to any sort of higher ups. I don't want to say that the guy is like super privileged or what. I think this is sort of humility that definitely comes across. I don't think anyone's going to accuse Toby of not being humble.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the first things, that comes across by the way he speaks and presents himself. But I think I really just want to highlight how one of the things that makes Deltarune so unique is that it's a team of creatives, sort of actually similar to Onion Games, who made Moon RPG. That it's a team of creatives that don't really need to answer to any sort of profitability. I mean, they need to be somewhat profitable, but let's be honest. No matter what, even if Deltarune Chapter 7 releases and it's like a 5-minute screen of like Rouse reading out like the Wikipedia article for like a bridge, people will still buy it in droves.
Depends on the bridge.
Because it depends on the bridge. Well, it might be a really good bridge.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm always down to read a Wikipedia article about a bridge. That's one of my favorite things to do.
And you know what? You're only going to find out how good the bridge is if you buy the game. So
That's
you
right.
better make sure that you buy Deltarune Chapter 7, The Tale of the Bridge. No, but I do think that is something really important to it. And it's kind of why a lot of AAA studios are fascinated by indie games right now, because you can't profit drive soul. You can't hire people to give something love. That's something that someone has to want to do. And other people just need to give them a chance to show it.
I mean, it's why the most exciting game to come out of Microsoft in the last 10 years was Josh Sawyer's passion project about the medieval Alps. I'm talking about Pentiment here, for those who aren't familiar, which is a sort of a narrative-driven game with this beautiful sort of hand-drawn art style. About an artist who's working in an abbey, illuminating books in the medieval period, and it's just this tremendous work of like I don't know, bridging empathy across history. And it's a very fascinating story because it's basically a game that you only get to make under the Microsoft umbrella if you've already done some smash hit games beforehand, right? And being able to carve out that space.
Done Fallout New Vegas.
Yeah, if you directed Fallout New Vegas, you get to do, there's this common expression in film, one for them, one for me, where there's a lot of, there's a lot of directors who work within the studio system who create these big, blockbusters, and then use the money from that blockbuster to create a smaller, personal, a more intimate project. And we've seen that approach have a lot of hit or miss ideas. I mean, we've seen a lot of great directors get stuck making one for them forever, where the financial pressures are just however it works. I don't know, maybe it's just too exciting to get to work with all that money. And then you get Barry Jenkins making Lion King slop. And but games, it's interesting because games historically have not so much had that one for them, one for me structure, but we've been talking about almost all of the exceptions to that rule because some of the most interesting games of all time have come from those exceptions, right? Of, people who have carved out these little spaces of freedom for themselves in the ruthless game dev space to be able to explore and push the boundaries of games.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you play Moon RPG, one of the things that I felt like just kept hitting me over and over again is how clearly this was made by a team of artists. You've got, the sound team making 36 radio-like songs that just to go on the music player that, honestly, most players probably won't even bother to listen to. But you've also got, I don't want to call them enemies, that's kind of goes against the whole point. You've got animals, yes. You've got animals who are made of clay, or plasticine, which, I'm just gonna say right now, 3D modeling was not at the point yet where you could have just done that, in a program. Those had to have been made in real life. And then
they look certain. They look like photographs of claymation type models for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And it's you've got the fusion of that, of the music. You've got every time you talk to a character, it sounds like someone's speaking in a sort of weird, you can almost hear certain words and how they're speaking, but nothing really coheres to anything, but you can hear their voice behind it.
The voice blips in this game are so cool. I'm actually I'm gonna give myself a hard editing task, and I'm gonna insert a few of the voice blips here just so you can hear them because they're so cool. So just right now in this podcast, a few voice blips are gonna play for a little bit.
জিজ্ঞাসুগুলো হলো 3 কতগুলো দেশের 5 বাংলা বাংলা জিজ্ঞাসুগুলো হলো
Sang minus still your most endearing property of the Greek element. I'm the reason they wrote it.
โลบากโลบาก
And that's a very good point, character from Moon RPG. You look around everywhere in here, there's ideas about the world, about society. Some of them I would say are a little outdated in their presentation, but they're still obviously very honest and earnest. That it really feels like that this was made by an art collective who wanted to make art before they wanted to make a game, and then realized that they had to make both, and therefore this is a game that is as much about its artisticness as it is about its gameplay, and that I think that's a good reason why it was. I wouldn't say it is the first game that is like what it is, because there are definitely very small little games that have little pieces of things that Moon did, but it's definitely the first game that really managed to concentrate and focus down just sort of raw expression and raw wanting to make something that said something and felt something, not just to make something to make money for a company that's descended from a gambling company and is partnering with a toy company.
Yeah. And I do want to tie this into Deltarune a little bit, because we've been talking about its influence on Undertale, but, I kept thinking about the sword route, the original game, the game within a game in the chapter 3 secret, when I was thinking about the hero blazing this path of destruction. And it just feels like there's this energy of like destruction being power, and the power to destroy being the only power, being the real power that video games give you. And you just feel so when you're playing both the Deltarune sword route and when you're playing Moon and seeing the trail of destruction that leaves, you actually, I don't know, you get to feel gross about it, right? You get to feel like all these other games are not understanding fully like what, I don't know, like how the actual implications. And I think Moon and Toby's output both are the result of thinking for a really, really long time about the actual implications of like what are all these game mechanics that we take for granted actually mean, you know?
I mean, that's the thing, right? It's like one of the most the common complaints about a lot of sort of big AAA games is they'll have some sort of moral choice at the end where they're like, are you really gonna kill me? Killing me makes me as bad as you. But you've killed like 1,000 guys to get here. What makes this guy any more worthwhile? What makes their life any more valuable than all of these guys? Like money, status? Like, why do I care? Like, I've got a gun, and that shoots through people the same, regardless of how much money they have. But that never really gets addressed by those games, because not really thinking about that angle of it. But if I may talk about Undertale, again, just to talk about it into Deltarune, Undertale was quite honest with this with Chara, right? Chara is supposed to be this sort of avatar of progression, like a sort of amalgam of that drive to level up and become more powerful. And Chara's ultimate thing is, while I might have been guiding you, you're the one who chose to go down this path. And that path is, it's reeked with blood, it's reeked with death, and it uses the "but nobody came," which, for those that don't know, that was originally from Earthbound and Mother 3. That was something that a character would say if they tried to summon another enemy onto the screen, but the screen was full up, or it exceeded the summon limit for that battle. It would say, enemy tried to summon, called for help, but nobody came. And in Undertale, it's used in a very similar way to say, like, it really contextualizes that as a cry for help, a cry for someone to please come here and help me defeat this person who's trying to kill me. But nobody came. It really, really focuses and highlights the fact that you are just going around slaughtering helpless creatures who don't really mean you harm, but because you have the power to do them harm, you are executing that power. And in Deltarune, I think, because unfortunately I feel like a lot of people came away from Undertale thinking, well, that wasn't me, that was Chara. Because I think that like the ending, I think they might have found that the ending was a bit too ambiguous, even though I think it's quite clear. I can see why someone would think it's quite ambiguous. So I think that what Toby tries to do in Deltarune is that he tries to sort of tie it into the character Chris, because Chris is a child. Chris plays games in the way a child plays them, and that means that Chris has those same predilections. So rather than having some sort of, this detached avatar who is the reason that you can go fight and level up and do a big murder spree, which is, admittedly not really how it is. It's not like we have a sort of inner spirit of violence that's different from us. It's a part of us. And it's the same thing for Chris. And I think it's more honestly done with Chris, that, Chris can love these people, and Chris can love these creatures who are being presented as enemies and not attack or kill any of them. But there's still the drive to progress. There's still the drive to level up. Even if you're not killing enemies, you're getting to a recruit number out of number. You're still progressing in some way, but you're just finding a different way to progress. I remember that Toby Fox made a sort of a slight joking remark, I think, just before Chapter 3 and 4's release, or maybe it was just after, that he didn't want anybody to mindlessly just act and save enemies. But unfortunately, I think that's actually how most people play, and I think he knows that. That a lot of the time, like, you go play against an enemy once, you see how an action interacts with them, and then you kind of skip through the dialogue and later ones because you know what it says and you know what it does. But I think that that's something that he's definitely sort of aware of, and I think that kind of plays again back into the fact that this call to progress is not detached. It's part of the gameplay experience, and it's how violent you're going to make it. That's how I guess it's contextualized in the game. It's difficult to sort of summarize this because I think that this is something that's still ongoing to be developed in Deltarune, and I think we'll see more of this as the game comes out. But I think it's kind of clear that, especially with the fact that each chapter has a fight that you have to attack in, I think at least most of them do, that like there is still at some point we have to confront the fact that even if we're subverting the combat RPG options and the ability to do that's still there, and the fact that it's there makes it meaningful to that.
And that reminds me of the very last thing about Moon that I want to hit, is that when characters die in Moon, or like basically it's like the fundamental building block of this game's narrative are represented by these like computer chip looking things that look sort of like, I don't know, like the RAM or CPU inside the PlayStation 1 that the game is being played on, that like they're called ROM, but they're, they look like computer chips. They look like memory chips or CPUs or whatever. They look like part of the console architecture that you're playing the game on. And those are the like fundamental things that the character's basic facts are inscribed upon. And it reminded me so much of the prophecy and the prophecy panels in chapter 4 of like, there are these inescapable facts about the game world that are written as rules because it's a video game. And is it possible to change them? Can you change those rules with love alone? That's like one of the fundamental things that Ralsei is struggling with in Deltarune. It's one of the fundamental things that, that the question on the ending of Moon of if your love is enough struggles with. And it just feels like you can draw this uninterrupted line from 1997 to 2025 by asking this question of like, what are the limits of game architecture, right? Like that's what we've been probing at and inquiring here. And I don't know, I just love that. I love that it's asking questions about the limits of the medium, and it's asking questions about how our feelings reflect back off the medium, and how when the screen goes dark, it's our face reflected in the screen, and it's our love reflected in the game. And I don't know, it's why I love talking about this ongoing thing, and I think it's just such an exciting space to be in moving forward.
No, absolutely. I mean, to sort of return to that and to again like bring it into Deltarune. I mean, to me, when I saw Rum, the thing I immediately thought to do was, oh, you mean like Red Rum?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think it is, because what murder is in these games. It's you're killing these enemies and removing their ability to impact you. They just become data. They just become a series of commands and lines of code at that point. When you only see them as an enemy, that is the point at which they've been murdered. Not the point at which you actually kill them, but the point at which you stop empathizing with them and start just seeing them as data objects. And to me, Ralsei is almost like a character that's like as if they played Moon RPG and they got to the end and they pressed yes to continue, because they desperately wanted to change that. Maybe because, to some degree, he feels the same would happen to him. Not that I mean, maybe he's actually played Moon RPG. I think he'd have a different deal with a lot of things if that was the case. Maybe be a bit more peaceful. But he sort of, he kind of knows that the moment everything dies is the moment that they can no longer be loved or give love anymore. It's the moment that they become just code, just data to be forgotten about. And I think his idea is if we can love these things, then maybe they can continue to live. Even if they don't actually get to live, they can live in our hearts in the same way that when we play a game, even if we get to the end and characters have to die, or just the game has to end and therefore we can't see any more of the characters. Or even a game, a book, a movie, a comic, anything. We get to the end, but it's the ending for the art. But it's not the ending for, what we were there for, which is the synthesis between us and the art, the the thing that we make from it, that experience, that still lives on in our heads and our hearts. And it's harrowing. It's difficult to deal with the idea that you can't save these people. It's difficult to deal with the idea that, like, I played One Shot, for example. I'm not sure who's played this, and that game very much deals with a lot of these themes. And, you know, at the end of that game, I cried because I realized that this was the end of my journey here. And I had developed such an attachment to these characters, and I'm not going to know what happens to them. I'm not going to know if they're going to be alright after this. And it's a really strong emotion it leaves you with. It leaves you with a very panging anxiety that I think Rousey really embodies, because he knows that. You know, imagine being a character in a game and you know how it's going to end, and you know that you're Data, and you desperately want to be more than that. It's a horrible situation to be in.
It is, and I'm so curious about how that Frishan and how that tension is going to resolve in the time period. And you know, that's one of those things we just have to look ahead to, and we can also look to the past and consider. And we are so basically out of time here. But I want to give you the chance, because as we're looking to the past and looking to Deltarune's influences, we may get some understanding of the future. And so I want to give you a little bit of time to talk about the influences of, you know, how the scrapped ending of Moon might have something to say about Deltarune moving forward. So I'll let you do that, and that'll close us out.
Sure thing, yeah. So I want to just quickly say that I'm not trying to do a theorization. You know, I'm not trying to tell you how Deltarune's going to end. I don't think that's super important. Not that I am against people doing that. I think it's fun, and I think it can be very constructive and very good. But that's not really what I want to do. It's more I want to take a thematic analysis here, and I think I want to apply it to Deltarune. So in the scrapped ending to Moon, what happens is, so this hero, who is also you, essentially you kind of go to this place called the Dragon's Tail. It's essentially a sort of metaphysical ascension to the Dragon's Castle. And as you go there and get to the end, you are with you, but outside of the armor. The armor which other people in the game says that it's a sort of cursed armor that imprisons one's heart within it. But you, not you the player, but you the person who is alongside you the player, naked and crying, this naked crying child, you move up into the castle, and you see as this child is basically forced to confront all of this horror and crime and death that they've done in this world. And they have no memory of it. They have no idea that this was something that they did or that they caused this suffering. And it's because, obviously, they couldn't have known. The way the game presented itself to them, they only saw it as saving the world. They didn't realize that they were making everybody suffer. And as sort of the animals come in to basically ask for solace and to ask to be healed by the player child, using the healing items and the resources they've gathered along the way, they slowly turn into the dragon they were going to slay. There wasn't ever a dragon to begin with other than the player themselves. And when they realize that they were the dragon they were coming to slay, and they realize that they are about to be slain by themselves, they sort of beseech you, they urge you to sort of avert this, you know, to not sort of forget that this has happened. And to me, it's sort of I think the reason that this was scrapped is because it is a little sort of I wouldn't say preachy, but it definitely is a little bit scolding of the player for playing the game, right? But I get what they were going for, that you don't know what horror you've caused, and when you atone for the horror, you'll find that you were the thing that you were trying to defeat all along. Like, you were in many ways, like, sort of, the big bad was actually sort of only the big bad to yourself. And I think I think I kind of see the little bits and pieces of this in Deltarune, especially with sort of how Chris is clearly kind of between different allegiances, is kind of in this mixed state where they care for their friends, but they don't know really how they can balance that with the mission, the whatever this plot that's going on is whatever has to drive them forward. And I think that what we're going to end up seeing is this same sort of thematic parallel of sort of being made to atone for crimes of a game that you didn't realize that you were doing. Not in the sense that you're going to literally, like in Moon, have the creatures sort of line up and ask you and like beg you to sort of help them and undo the damage you've caused, but more so that what we're trying to fight, what we're trying to end, might be the innocent good all along, and it might just be us when we've learned how to love. Like, in the sense that we're going after this Roaring Knight, and we're trying to stop this whole roaring process, and we're trying to see if we can avert the prophecy. But what we're doing along the way, especially in things like the Snowgrave route, we're doing quite a lot, and we're changing quite a lot, and we're affecting people's lives quite heavily in the process of doing that. I mean, no matter what happens after Chapter 3, Undyne is gone. There are people who cared about Undyne. There are people who needed Undyne in their lives, and Undyne is gone. And that's as a sort of indirect result of our actions. And I think that this was sort of quite strongly done in Undertale with the whole... I'm not the biggest fan of the reveal of the level of violence and execution points, but I am a big fan of the thematic back end of that, which is to say that you might have seen this as something that you were just innocently doing and was, some sort of heroic gesture, but what you were doing was hurting people and displacing their lives. And yeah, again, I don't want to theorize. I don't want to say, my grand reveal is that Chris actually is the knight and Des is human. But I want to say that
no, we're gonna have another argument in the future about that.
A Green episode. But I think what we will see is this evaluative stopping point at some point where the way we've played the game and the way perhaps even that we've controlled and made Chris do things, we might just see Chris sort of doing that back to us, not in a sense of controlling us necessarily, but more in the sense that we might end up feeling that same sort of powerlessness and inability to choose what it is that we get to do and what we get to see in the same way that we've inflicted that upon Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're interested in that sort of dual role that Chris is playing and how that is, and the thematic implications of that, then please tune in next week because we've got our very first Chris-centric episode next week. So I hope everybody's looking forward to that.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, me
One of
too.
my favorite parts of that game.
Yes. And thank you so much for coming on, Elsie. This has been an awesome conversation. I'm sure it's the first of many that we'll have about this game.
Oh, for
sure. Go ahead and pick up Moon if you can. It's on basically everything now. There's an official.
Yeah, it's on Switch, Steam, PS4.
Yeah,
you got one of those.
I'm looking forward to spending more time with it now that I'm not on a deadline and I get to immerse myself in it a little more and just relax when I miss something instead of feeling like, darn, I know I'm not gonna get there by recording time. Elsie, do you have anything to plug?
Well, all I can say is follow along my Blue Sky, Photonic Dog. It might be photonic.dog. Right now it's photonic.dog.bsky.social because I'm not as cool. I'm working on a game. Probably not going to be done for a little while, but I post little updates about it every so often. I have a little dev diary. Other than that, listen to more of this podcast. Play Moon RPG. Play games by Onion Games. Let's plug Onion Games. They've got a few more games other than Moon RPG done, and they've also some of those also have translations, also by Tim Rogers, and they're all quite good. I'd also recommend we didn't really get to dive into some other inspiration I want to talk about, like Mother 3 or Brandish or anything. Maybe we'll talk about those another time. But yeah, come to my Blue Sky, check it out, follow if you like. But you know what? Go play good video games. There's so many good video games out there, and there's not enough people playing the good video games. So, like, yeah, that's my plug.
All right, thanks so much. See you next week,
Thank
everybody.
you. See you all later.
Thanks for listening. As per usual, you can get Survey Program wherever you get your podcast. That's on Apple, Spotify, or on gruppeshrike.net. That's GRUPPESHRIKE.net. Although the music for this episode wasn't by Highwell, our usual music is, and Highwell's got a new album coming out on Friday, so be sure to check that out at the link in the description. You can also follow Elsie on Blue Sky from the link there. And remember, you can join the Discord from the link in our description, chat about the show, chat about Deltarune, a bunch else with our really cool community there. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Shrike Amalgamated General Productions GmbH